Hey everyone, welcome back. And in this episode, we're gonna start building an application. And for our application, we're gonna build a simple to-do app, right? Because you have already probably built a to-do app like 1,000 times prior to watching this video. And would be a very stupid idea if we try to go build a to-do app. So instead, what I'm gonna try to build is a profile form, right? So we're gonna go ahead and try to fill out a profile and create our own profile, okay? So I have my app view component open, I have my application running, and here it is open. I'm gonna go ahead and delete all of this stuff, right? I'm gonna remove the link to Hello World component. I'm gonna remove the component from here. I'm going to create some space here and components. Let's delete the Hello World component as well. Generally, how you want to build Vue apps is you don't want to start creating components straight away unless you know what you're doing. If you're learning, write everything in one file, and then when you see things getting messy, extract those things into new components. All right. So let's start with something simple. Let's create a div, make a label. All right. And in here, we'll type in, let's just say first name. All right, let's say input. Okay, so we have our first name, input. Let me go ahead, I'll remove all of these styles except the margin top. Cool, so at the moment, this looks kind of okay-ish. Really, what we want is make it look a little bit better, right? So let's give it a class and let's give it text input, right? And let's do our styles text input label. I want that to be display block, so it takes up the whole row. There we go. Right, let me just move this down a little bit, like so. Okay. And now let's just create another div. And in here, we'll just output a first name. And let's make a data field where we are going to return an object, which is going to be the data for this this form, right? And let's make a property first name, and let's vModel first name. Okay, so let's see what it's crying about. Right, we haven't instantiated it. Cool, my mistake. Okay, so let's type something in, and we can see the result is getting typed out. So we get two-way model binding. Cool. So we have this label, we have this input field. What else can we add to here, right? So let's actually wrap this in a div, like so. And let's give this another div. And let's call this validation, right? And then here I will say validation. And let's not forget the dot. I'm going to give this a font size of 10 pixels, so I want it to be kind of small. Okay, let's do something like text limit, and let's say 15. All right, so now we want to say, right, the model that we bound to the input field, we want to basically count up, right? When it's going to pass this limit, it's no longer valid, and we want to prevent that from happening. Okay, so let's go to our computed properties, and let's do input count. All right, and then here let's return this dot first name, the length. Okay. So now we can do something like this. So input count out of text limit. Okay. And maybe a little bit too small. Let's try to give this a 12 pixels. Yeah, that'll be all right. And let's text align right. Okay, so I want this to be on this side though. Let's actually make our input of width, or rather display block as well, and make sure that our input doesn't live inside our label, and give it a width of 100%. Okay, cool. So this is a little bit too big. I'd say let's for now give this a style of width 200 pixels. Okay, so the whole thing is less. And if you can see, we can type in, but we can type in past the limit. Okay, so we want to prevent it from typing in past 15 characters, right? So for this, we can create a watcher for our first name, right? Let's bind a function to this, and in here we can pass in some values. So new value and old value. Okay, so for now, let's just console log new value and old value so we can see what's happening. Some new prettier syntax. Never mind. Over here, refresh this. Cool. So if I type in A, B, so you can see that the new value will be AB and the old one will be A. Okay, so here we want to check if the new value dot length bigger than this dot text limit, this dot first name equals old value. Okay, so basically we just want to override the value. So let's try to type something in, and you can see the more I type, no new values will be added, right? So now we have a basically something that prevents the user from typing in a length of bigger than 15, right? We don't want this field to be empty, okay? So we can approach this with two ways. So first one will be let's just do this. Let's just give it a message of, right, if this is empty, let's give an error, okay? So is empty, okay? And return this the first name dot length equals 0, okay? So if it's empty, let's bind a class and let's actually give it a valid. Okay, so let's create a new valid property here, and let's say, right, we want to basically bind return a class that it's going to make it either valid, so it's going to go green, or be invalid and it's going to go red. So return this dot is empty. So if it's empty, we want to return invalid. Otherwise, we want to say that it's valid. Okay, and let's actually call it validation class. Okay, and whoa, actually I wanted to put it here, validation class. There we go. All right, and let's make our invalid and valid classes. Okay, so I just want to apply it to the input for now. So input valid, border 1 pixel, solid green. Copy this. Let's make this invalid. Say red. Okay. So at the moment it's red, as we'd expect. Is this enough of an indicator? I think so. And if we start typing, you can see that it goes green. So at the moment, this is valid, and we're sort of saying, right, this is in our valid range. Okay. So, cool. Very nice. What about if we want to go and create a second name, right? And we want to capture that as well. Well, this is your first case where you're like, right, I'm going to create a second name here. I'm going to create a text limit for this. And essentially, this should be your little red flag, right? I need to implement validation, or sorry, not validate. I need to implement, I need to take this out into its own component. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. Let's go into components and let's create a new component and let's call it a text field dot view. All right, because it's a text field. Now again, sorry, let me go to extensions and let me just point you to this VTour VS Code extension. Make sure you have it installed. Otherwise, you might be missing out on a few features that I'm using here in terms of syntax highlighting and code snippets. All right, so make sure you got that installed. So back in our text field, let's type in scaffold, and this will allow us to, this will basically just scaffold this little template for us here. And for our styles here, I'm gonna type in lang and stylus. So if you remember, this is the style preprocessor that I chose. I'm gonna go ahead and take this div here. I'm gonna put it in this template here. Okay. So I'm gonna leave the first name here. I will still copy everything that I have here. And I'm gonna put it into this export default. All right. And let me just now remove the watcher and this text limit. I'm gonna remove it from here as well. And like so. So let's go to the text field real quick and this first name, right? Let's once you highlight it, press Ctrl F2, and now you can type in value. All right. Oh, value. So now this will essentially rename every first name, anything that matches first name in this file. Okay. So now that we have value and we can bind it, right? So the value, we want to pass it to the text field, and the text limit, we want to pass it to this component. So essentially what we want to do is we want to say props, right? And these will be our props, okay? Now, value, we want it to be there all the time, right? We don't want somebody to create a text field without a value, okay? So let's open brackets here and let's say required true, okay? And below it, after we put a comma here, I'm gonna say type string, okay? And for text limit, you don't always want to see a text limit, so let's go ahead and say that this is gonna be required false, okay? And the type, let's say it's a number, okay? And in here we can say if text limit is more than 0, so then we can essentially display this counter validation. All right, everything else I think looks all right. So now let's import this component. And the way you really want to do this, you can do dot. So we're in app.view, so you can do dot slash components slash text field. Let's take the text field, make sure you remove these curly brackets, otherwise this won't work. And we put this text field in components, and now let's render this text field. Make sure you have a closing tag. Okay. So now we get a console error, and it's basically saying missing required prop value, right? So we have to bind something to it. So let's do value, bind, and first name. Cool, there's our first name, and you can see it's shining red because it's required, and we don't have a limiter, okay? So what we can do, if we want to set a limit to it, so we have text limit. So text limit, let's bind 15 again to it, and there we go. So we have a limit of 15 characters. Nice. Let's clear this for a second, and I think I saw avoid mutating a prop directly. Okay, so you can see what we're doing here. We're basically, since the root of this value is living in this parent component, we're not allowed to mutate it in this child component. So what we essentially need to do is anytime this value is, we want to change it, we want to basically tell our parent to change this value to whatever we set it, right? So the way we can do this is we can actually use v model. So we have our first name, right? And now where we bind it v model to here, let's actually do value. And let's say on input, emit, input, and it's going to automatically pass in the value inside of there. So let's refresh for good measure. And you can see we get an error again, and that's because I forget to pass target.value. So I just forgot to pass the what's called the value for this target. So again, let me refresh, type it in, and there we go, all good. Another error that we get here is, again, we're directly mutating this prop. So we do this in our watcher here. So this is where we want to replace, and we essentially just want to replace it with this event again. So let's grab this. Let's put this here. Let's take the old value, and instead of event.target, let's pass in the old value. Okay, let's refresh, and again, let's try to type past the counter. And I'm being very bad right now, so this dot emit, and there we go. Okay, so we have successfully extracted this into its own component. So let's go ahead, extend our form. Let's put in a last name, like so. Let's give it a second text field. Let's give it last name. And there we go. So you can see the first name and the isn't changing, but let's quickly make a computed here, computer property, and I just want to say full name and return this dot first name plus, I'm gonna skip the fancy ES6 string interpolation and take this full name and place it here. Refresh this. Okay, there we go. Cool. So actually, let's do another field here. So we take care of the label, and let's say label. It's not required, and let's say that it's a string. Okay, and here we can say label. Nice. So now when we bind it, we can say label equals And let's not bind it like this, but rather we can just bind it like so. So first name and label last name. Right, so you don't have to use this tag, which is essentially the bind, right? You don't need to use it. You can just use regular HTML attributes. It's essentially the same as we would want to bind a string this way, right? So it's the same thing. And there we go. Okay, so this will be it for this episode. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. Leave a like, subscribe, and see you in the next one.